The thunderous crack of the church door slamming against its frame echoed through Sweetwater Junction like a gunshot, turning every head along the dusty main street of the small Texas town. Ruby Zimmerman stood trembling on the church steps, her chestnut hair tumbling from its pins, her green eyes wide with both defiance and disbelief as Reverend Holloway's words still rang in her ears. "We will not abide such sinful displays in the house of the Lord." The year was 1878, and Ruby had committed what the town elders considered an unforgivable transgression. She had danced not just any dance, but a lively, spirited dance from her mother's Spanish homeland during what was meant to be a solemn church gathering. "Jezebel!" someone called from the gathering crowd. "Harlot!" cried another. Ruby clutched her shawl tightly around her shoulders, willing herself not to cry. At 22 years old, she had never imagined that the joy her mother had instilled in her, the freedom found in dancing, would lead to public humiliation. By order of the town council, Reverend Holloway proclaimed from the church doorway, his voice carrying across the street, "Ruby Zimmerman is no longer welcome at services or town gatherings until she repents of her wanton ways and demonstrates proper Christian modesty." Ruby's father, a respected but aging shopkeeper, stood silently beside the reverend, his eyes downcast, unwilling or unable to defend his only child. Since her mother's death 3 years ago, he had retreated into his grief and his Bible, finding solace in the rigid structure the reverend offered. "Papa, please," Ruby whispered, but Simon Zimmerman merely shook his head, turning away as if the sight of his daughter pained him. The crowd parted as Ruby descended the steps, her legs unsteady. Mrs. Patterson, who had been her mother's friend, turned her back. Mr. Wilson, who bought ribbon from their shop every month for his wife, spat in the dirt as she passed. Only Mrs. Abernathy, the elderly widow who lived at the edge of town, dared to meet Ruby's eye with a look of sympathy, but even she did not speak. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the murmurs of the crowd. A tall figure on horseback slowed his palomino to a walk. The stranger took in the scene with curious blue eyes beneath the wide brim of his hat. He was trail-worn but carried himself with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to hard living and harder choices. "What seems to be the commotion here?" he asked, his voice deep and measured. No one answered immediately, the townspeople suddenly finding great interest in their boots or the distant horizon. "They're casting me out," Ruby said, lifting her chin despite the tears threatening to spill. "For dancing." The stranger's eyebrows rose slightly, the only indication of his surprise. "Dancing," he repeated. "The devil's temptation," Reverend Holloway interjected, stepping forward. "This is a matter for our town to handle, stranger. We don't need outsiders interfering in our moral governance." The man dismounted smoothly, revealing his considerable height. He removed his hat in a gesture of respect that somehow managed to seem both courteous and mocking. "Garrett Flynn," he introduced himself. "Just passing through on my way to Fort Worth. Thought I might stay a spell, but I'm not sure I fancy a town that banishes young ladies for dancing." His eyes found Ruby's again, and something in them made her breath catch. Seems a harsh punishment for something so natural as expressing joy. Ruby felt a flutter of gratitude amid her despair. It had been so long since anyone had defended her, especially a man as imposing as this stranger. "Mr. Flynn," the Reverend began sternly, "while we welcome travelers, we expect them to respect our ways. This woman," Garrett interrupted firmly, "has a name, I expect." "Ruby," she supplied, finding her voice. "Ruby Zimmerman." Garrett nodded, replacing his hat. "Miss Zimmerman, a pleasure despite the circumstances." He turned back to the Reverend. "Where I come from, dancing is considered a gift, not a sin." "And where might that be?" Reverend Holloway asked suspiciously. All over, Garrett replied vaguely. Drove cattle from Texas to Montana, fought in the war, worked the railroads east to west. Seen a lot of places where folks celebrate with dance instead of condemning it. Ruby could see the town council members exchanging uncomfortable glances. Strangers could mean trouble, but they could also mean business, and Sweetwater Junction needed the latter desperately since the railroad had bypassed them the previous year. Well, Mr. Flynn, Mayor Billings finally spoke up, stepping forward with a politician's smile, we're not saying the young lady is banished from town entirely, just from certain moral gatherings, until she shows proper repentance. Garrett looked skeptical. And what constitutes proper repentance? The Reverend cleared his throat. Modest behavior, dedication to Bible study, and certainly no more of that wild dancing. Ruby felt her heart sink. The dancing connected her to her mother, to her heritage. It was the one time she felt truly alive, truly herself. Garrett studied her face, seeming to read her thoughts. Then he turned back to the crowd. Seems to me dancing isn't the problem, it's where she's doing it. He gestured toward the church. You don't want dancing in your church, fair enough. But if Miss Zimmerman had a proper place to dance, there's no proper place for such displays. The Reverend interrupted. Garrett's smile was slow and determined. Then I'll build one. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I'll build a floor, Garrett continued, his voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. A proper dance floor where Miss Zimmerman can twirl again without offending your delicate sensibilities, Reverend. Ruby stared at him, astonished by this unexpected champion. You would do that? For a stranger, Garrett's eyes softened as they met hers. Sometimes strangers become friends, Miss Zimmerman, and sometimes a little defiance is exactly what a town needs. For the first time since her mother's passing, Ruby felt a spark of hope ignite within her chest. This man, this cowboy with his weathered face and kind eyes, had done what no one else in Sweetwater Junction had dared. He had defended her right to be herself. Where would you build such a thing? Mayor Billings demanded, his earlier diplomacy giving way to concern. We have ordinances about new structures. I have land. Mrs. Abernathy suddenly spoke up, stepping forward with surprising vigor for her 70 years. The old barn on my property's just sitting empty since my Harold passed. If Mr. Flynn wants to put a floor in there, he has my blessing. The Reverend sputtered. Elizabeth, you cannot seriously. I seriously can, Thomas Holloway. Mrs. Abernathy cut him off. You've been telling this town what to think for 15 years, and I'm tired of it. Harold always said dancing kept the heart young, and I'm inclined to agree. Ruby felt tears of gratitude prick her eyes. Mrs. Abernathy had always slipped her candies as a child and had taught her to embroider after her mother died. But this unexpected alliance was beyond anything she could have hoped for. That settles it then, Garrett said, clapping his hands together as if the matter were resolved. I'll start tomorrow. This is outrageous, the Reverend protested. This is progress, Garrett countered. He turned to Ruby. If you'll allow me to escort you home, Miss Zimmerman. Ruby hesitated, glancing at her father who still stood silent by the church steps. My father will need time to reconsider his position, Garrett finished diplomatically. Sometimes men need space to remember what's truly important. With a small nod, Ruby accepted his offered arm, feeling the solid strength of him as they walked toward his horse. Behind them, the crowd buzzed with excited speculation and outrage. You don't have to do this, Ruby whispered as they moved out of earshot. You'll make enemies before you've even unpacked your saddlebags. Garrett helped her mount his horse before swinging up behind her, his presence warm and steady at her back. I've made worse enemies for lesser causes, Miss Zimmerman. Besides, he added with a smile she could hear in his voice. "I've always been partial to dancing." As they rode toward her father's shop at the far end of the street, Ruby felt a strange mixture of trepidation and exhilaration. This man was a complete stranger, yet he had shown her more kindness in 10 minutes than her neighbors had in years. "Why?" she asked simply. Garrett was quiet for a moment. "My mother was a dancer," he finally said. "In New Orleans, the way folks treated her. Well, let's just say I understand what it's like to be judged unfairly." Ruby's heart softened. "Was she?" "She died when I was 16. Consumption." His voice was matter of fact, but Ruby sensed the old pain beneath the words. "Before she passed, she made me promise I'd never let anyone tell me what kind of man to be." "She sounds wonderful," Ruby said sincerely. She was. Garrett reined in his horse outside the modest storefront with Zimmerman's General Goods painted above the door. "And I suspect your mother must have been something special too, to raise a daughter brave enough to dance when everyone else stands still." Ruby felt a blush warm her cheeks as he helped her down from the horse. "Thank you, Mr. Flynn, for everything." "Garrett," he corrected with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "And I haven't done anything yet, but I will." He tipped his hat. "I'll see you tomorrow, Miss Zimmerman. We have a floor to build." As he rode away toward the town's only hotel, Ruby watched him go with a strange fluttering in her chest. For the first time in years, she felt as if she might be on the cusp of something new, something that belonged solely to her. The next morning dawned clear and warm, a perfect late spring day. Ruby rose early, her sleep having been fitful at best. Her father had returned late the previous evening, avoiding her gaze as he ate the stew she'd prepared in silence, before retreating to his room with barely a word. She dressed carefully in her work dress, a practical blue cotton with short sleeves that would allow for movement, and braided her hair tightly to keep it from her face. If this cowboy was serious about building a floor, she intended to help. A soft knock at the back door startled her. She opened it to find Garrett standing there, hat in hand, looking freshly shaven and somehow more handsome in the morning light. "I thought it might be easier if we left from here," he explained. "Less of an audience." Ruby nodded gratefully. "Let me just leave a note for my father." She quickly scribbled that she would be at Mrs. Abernathy's for the day and followed Garrett to where his horse waited in the alley behind the shop. "I spoke with Mrs. Abernathy last night," he told her as they rode. "She's quite a character. Offered me coffee laced with whiskey and told me about half the town's secrets before I could finish my first cup." Ruby laughed despite herself. "That sounds like her. She and my mother were close. Mama taught her Spanish cooking, and Mrs. Abernathy taught Mama English gardening. They were an unlikely pair." "The best friendships usually are," Garrett observed, guiding his horse along the edge of town where curious eyes would be less likely to spot them. Mrs. Abernathy's property lay a quarter-mile beyond the town's boundary, close enough to be convenient, but far enough to offer privacy. The main house was a modest 2-story structure, well-maintained despite its age. The barn, however, had seen better days, its red paint faded to a dusty pink, one door hanging slightly askew on its hinges. The elderly woman herself stood on the porch, waving vigorously as they approached. "Right on time," she called. "I've got breakfast waiting and tools in the barn." My Harold was quite the carpenter in his day. Over plates of eggs and biscuits, Mrs. Abernathy explained that the barn had once hosted small gatherings years ago, before Reverend Holloway had gained his iron grip on the town's social life. "People used to know how to enjoy themselves around here," she said, pouring more coffee. "Dancing, singing, a little harmless flirtation. Then Thomas Holloway arrived with his fire and brimstone, and suddenly everything joyful became sinful." How did he gain so much influence? Garrett asked, accepting a third biscuit with a grateful nod. Mrs. Abernathy snorted. Fear is a powerful motivator, young man. Tell people they're headed for damnation unless they follow your rules, and most will fall in line. Especially after the war, when folks were looking for certainty in an uncertain world. And my father? Ruby asked quietly. It was a question she'd been afraid to voice for years. The older woman's eyes softened. Simon was always devout, but it was your mother who kept him balanced. Alina had a way of reminding him that God created joy as well as duty. She reached across the table to pat Ruby's hand. When we lost her, he lost that balance. The reverend filled the void with rigid doctrine. Ruby nodded, blinking back sudden tears. It made sense: her father's withdrawal, his increasing strictness, his inability to look at her when she danced and resembled her mother most. Well, Garrett said after a respectful moment, we can't change the past, but we might be able to change a few minds about the future. He stood, placing his napkin beside his empty plate. Shall we see about that floor? The barn proved to be in better condition than its exterior suggested. The roof was sound, and the large central space was open and airy once they propped both doors fully open. This is perfect, Garrett said, examining the packed earth floor. We'll need to level it first, then lay a moisture barrier before the actual floorboards. He glanced at Ruby. It's going to be hard work. She rolled up her sleeves. I'm stronger than I look. His smile was approving. I don't doubt it for a second. They spent the morning clearing the space of old hay and debris, working side by side in comfortable conversation. Ruby learned that Garrett had indeed been many things: a cavalry soldier, a cattle driver, a railroad worker, but had most recently been working as a carpenter in Austin, helping rebuild after a fire. I'm handy with tools, he explained, demonstrating by quickly repairing the wobbly barn door. Picked it up from a fellow I rode with after the war. Said a man should always have a trade to fall back on when his wandering days were done. And are your wandering days done? Ruby asked, trying to sound merely conversational as she swept the last of the dirt into a pile. Garrett paused in his work, looking thoughtful. I'm 30 next birthday, been moving since I was 16. Sometimes I think it might be nice to stay somewhere, build something that lasts. His eyes met hers briefly before returning to the door hinge, but it would have to be the right place. With the right people. Ruby felt her cheeks warm. Sweetwater Junction hardly seems like the right place for someone who values freedom as you seem to. Towns can change, he replied simply. People too. By midday, they had cleared the space, and Garrett had drawn up plans for the floor using charcoal on a scrap of paper. Mrs. Abernathy brought them lunch, thick sandwiches and cold lemonade, and informed them that word had spread through town about their project. Thomas Holloway is beside himself, she reported with obvious satisfaction. Gave a spontaneous sermon this morning about the evils of worldly entertainment. Called you the stranger bringing corruption to our midst, Mr. Flynn. Garrett laughed. I've been called worse. And Ruby's father. Mrs. Abernathy added more gently. He came by my house after services, wanted to know if Ruby was safe. I told him his daughter was perfectly fine and working hard on a project that would make her mother proud. Ruby's throat tightened. What did he say to that? Nothing out loud. But his eyes said plenty. The older woman patted Ruby's shoulder. Give him time, dear. The heart takes longer to heal than the body. After lunch, Garrett hitched his horse to Mrs. Abernathy's wagon, and they rode into town for supplies. Ruby had been nervous about facing the townspeople, but to her surprise, not everyone shared the reverend's outrage. The lumberyard owner, Mr. Peterson, gave them a fair price and even offered to deliver the materials the next morning. Between you and me, he confided as he wrote up their order. "My wife hasn't stopped talking about your dancing since Sunday, Miss Ruby. Says it reminded her of when she was young in San Antonio. At the Mercantile, Mrs. Wilson, whose husband had spat in the dirt as Ruby passed, discreetly slipped extra nails into their package and whispered, "My Martha loves to dance too. She's just turned 18. Might she come see your floor when it's finished?" By the time they returned to Mrs. Abernathy's, Ruby's spirits had lifted considerably. "I had no idea," she said wonderingly as they unloaded their initial supplies. "I thought everyone agreed with the reverend. People are often braver in private than in public," Garrett observed. "It takes just one person willing to stand up first." "Like you did," Ruby said softly. He looked up from the tools he was organizing, his expression suddenly serious. "Ruby, I need to tell you something. I didn't just happen to be riding through Sweetwater Junction yesterday." Ruby's hands stilled on the paint cans she'd been arranging. "What do you mean?" Garrett set down the hammer he was holding. "I came here looking for work. I heard the town needed a carpenter for some repairs on the courthouse." He ran a hand through his hair, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "I arrived the night before, stayed at the hotel. Sunday morning, I was walking to find the mayor when I heard music coming from the church." Ruby's heart began to beat faster as understanding dawned. "You heard me playing the piano," he nodded. "I looked through the window, saw you dancing while everyone else was singing hymns. It was beautiful, like watching sunlight move. Then I saw the reverend's face, knew there would be trouble, so I waited nearby." "You were watching all along," Ruby whispered. "I shouldn't have," Garrett admitted. "But I couldn't look away. And then when they threw you out, I couldn't stay silent either." Ruby wasn't sure whether to feel flattered or misled. "So this whole project defending me, it wasn't just spontaneous gallantry." "The defense was genuine," Garrett assured her quickly. "But I'd already seen you, already." He trailed off, color rising in his tanned cheeks. "Already what?" Ruby pressed. "Already thought you were someone special," he finished quietly. "Someone worth knowing." The sincerity in his eyes made Ruby's indignation fade. There was something deeply moving about the idea that he had noticed her, truly noticed her, even before the drama unfolded. "Well," she said finally, trying to lighten the moment, "at least now I know you're not in the habit of building dance floors for every damsel in distress you encounter." His smile returned, relieved. "Only the ones who dance like you do." The lumber arrived early the next morning as promised, and work began in earnest. Garrett proved to be not only skilled but also an excellent teacher, showing Ruby how to measure twice and cut once, how to hold a hammer properly, how to check if boards were level. Other visitors began to appear as well. First came two young men from town, brothers who worked at the livery, offering to help with the heavy lifting. Then Martha Wilson arrived with her mother, bearing a basket of fresh bread and offers to sand the rough edges of the floorboards. By the third day, their project had become something of a community effort. Even Mayor Billings made a discreet appearance, ostensibly to ensure they weren't violating any building codes but staying to help nail down several rows of planking. The reverend's losing his grip, Mrs. Abernathy observed with satisfaction as she and Ruby prepared lunch for the workers. "People are remembering there's more to life than sitting stiff-backed in pews." Ruby watched through the kitchen window as Garrett showed Martha's younger brother how to properly seal the wood. In just a few days, this stranger had changed the entire dynamics of Sweetwater Junction, or perhaps merely revealed what had been hiding beneath the surface all along. "He's quite a man," Mrs. Abernathy remarked, following Ruby's gaze. "Yes," Ruby agreed softly. "He is." The older woman gave her a knowing look. "And handsome, too, with those blue eyes. Reminds me of my Harold when he was young, that same steady way about him." Ruby busied herself with slicing bread to hide her blush. "He'll be moving on once the floor is finished. He's not the staying type." "Hum," was all Mrs. Abernathy said, but her expression spoke volumes. As the days passed, Ruby found herself looking forward more and more to the time spent working beside Garrett. They developed an easy rhythm together, anticipating each other's needs, sharing smiles over private jokes, occasionally brushing hands as they passed tools back and forth. In the evenings, as the others departed, they would often sit on Mrs. Abernathy's porch, watching the sunset and talking about everything and nothing, his adventures across the West, her memories of her mother, books they had both read, dreams they harbored. "You miss it?" Ruby asked one evening as they shared a slice of Mrs. Abernathy's apple pie. "The traveling, I mean." Garrett considered the question seriously. "Parts of it. The open sky, the feeling of possibility around each bend in the trail." He glanced at her. "But lately I've been thinking there might be just as much possibility in staying put, building something, making connections that last." Ruby's heart skipped at the way his eyes lingered on her face. "That's quite a change of perspective for a wandering cowboy." "Well," he said with a slow smile, "I've had quite a change in what I've been looking at lately." On the 7th day, the floor was finished, a beautiful expanse of smooth, golden pine that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the barn's high windows. Garrett had even built a small raised platform at one end where musicians could sit. "It's perfect," Ruby breathed, standing in the center of the space, feeling the solid wood beneath her feet. "I can't believe we did this." "We had help," Garrett reminded her, gesturing to where Mrs. Abernathy and at least 15 townspeople stood admiring their work. "But it was your vision," Ruby insisted. "Your promise." His eyes were warm as they held hers. "A promise I was happy to keep." He hesitated, then asked, "Would you dance for us now, christen the floor properly?" Ruby glanced uncertainly at the gathered crowd. "I don't know if, please," Martha Wilson called out. "We've been working on this floor for a week. I want to see what all the fuss is about." Mrs. Abernathy stepped forward with a guitar that had belonged to her late husband. "I can't play Spanish music, but I can manage a decent waltz." Ruby looked back at Garrett, who nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, she kicked off her shoes and moved to the center of the floor. Mrs. Abernathy began to play, and Ruby closed her eyes, letting the music fill her. For a moment, she simply stood still, feeling the rhythm, remembering her mother's voice. "Dancing comes from the heart, my Vida. Let your body speak what your soul is feeling." Then she began to move. It wasn't the passionate flamenco that had scandalized the church. This was something gentler, yet no less expressive, a flowing, graceful dance that spoke of joy and longing and freedom. Her skirts swirled around her legs as she turned, her arms extending with fluid grace, her feet barely seeming to touch the new floor as she glided across it. When she finally stopped, breathless and flushed with exertion, there was a moment of complete silence. Then Martha Wilson began to clap, and the rest of the crowd joined in with enthusiastic applause and cheers. "That was beautiful," Garrett said quietly as he approached her, his eyes shining with something that made Ruby's heart race. "Exactly what this floor was made for." Before she could respond, a familiar figure appeared in the barn doorway, silhouetted against the late afternoon light. "Papa," Ruby whispered, her joy instantly tempered by apprehension. Simon Zimmerman stepped into the barn, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the scene. The crowd parted to let him through, conversations dying as tension filled the air. He walked slowly to where Ruby stood, his lined face solemn. For a long moment he simply looked at her, and she braced herself for condemnation. "You dance just like her," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "Your mother." Ruby nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. I couldn't bear it, he continued. After she died, seeing you dance, it hurt too much, reminded me of everything I'd lost. He glanced around at the beautiful floor, the gathered townspeople. But hiding from that pain, forbidding you to be who you are, that was wrong of me. Papa, Ruby managed, tears welling in her eyes. Mrs. Abernathy came to see me yesterday, he said. Reminded me that Alina would be heartbroken to see what I've allowed to happen, what I've become. He reached out tentatively to touch Ruby's cheek. Can you forgive an old fool who forgot that love should be stronger than fear? Ruby threw her arms around her father, feeling his tears dampen her hair as he held her close for the first time in years. There's nothing to forgive, she whispered. We both lost her. We both got lost. When they finally separated, Simon turned to Garrett, who had been standing respectfully to one side. You're the one who built this floor, he said. The one who stood up for my daughter when I failed to. Garrett nodded. Yes, sir, but Ruby's the one who inspired it. Simon studied the younger man carefully. Mrs. Abernathy says you're a good man, says you look at my daughter the way Harold used to look at her. Ruby felt heat rise to her cheeks. Mrs. Abernathy is very observant, Garrett replied steadily. And your intentions? Garrett glanced at Ruby, a question in his eyes. When she gave him a small nod, he turned back to her father. My intention was to keep traveling after this job was done, he said honestly. But now I find I'm reluctant to leave. If there's work to be had in Sweetwater Junction, and if your daughter would permit me to call on her properly, I'd like to stay. Simon looked between them, seeing what had grown in the days he'd kept his distance. After a moment, he sighed. There's work. My store needs repairs I've been putting off for too long, and as for calling on Ruby. He reached for his daughter's hand, placing it in Garrett's. That's for her to decide. Ruby felt the warm strength of Garrett's fingers curling around hers, saw the hope in his eyes, and knew her answer without hesitation. I would like that very much. Mrs. Abernathy clapped her hands. Well, since that's settled, I believe this is a dancing floor and we should dance. Simon, I know for a fact you can still waltz. Alina taught you well enough. To Ruby's amazement, her father actually smiled. I'm a bit rusty, Elizabeth, but if you'll forgive my missteps. As Mrs. Abernathy struck up another tune, and her father led the elderly woman in a somewhat stiff but earnest waltz. Others began to pair up around them. Martha Wilson's brother asked her to dance, and the Livery brothers found partners among the other young women who had helped with the floor. Garrett's hand tightened slightly around Ruby's. May I have this dance, Miss Zimmerman? Ruby smiled up at him. I thought you'd never ask, Mr. Flynn. As he led her in a smooth waltz around the floor they had built together, Ruby felt as if every step was bringing her closer to a future she hadn't dared imagine just days ago. I never thanked you properly, she said as they turned in perfect harmony. For what? Garrett asked. For seeing me, Ruby replied simply. For not looking away when it would have been easier. His hand tightened at her waist, drawing her a fraction closer than propriety strictly allowed. Looking away from you would be impossible, he said softly. From the moment I saw you dancing, I knew my wandering days were coming to an end. Is that so? Ruby's heart thrummed with happiness. A man knows when he's found someone worth stopping for. His blue eyes held hers with unwavering certainty. They banished you for dancing, and I said I'd build you a floor. But the truth is, Ruby Zimmerman, I'd build you a whole world if you'd let me. In that moment, surrounded by music and movement and the community that was rediscovering its joy, Ruby knew that she had found not just a champion but a partner. A man who saw her true self and celebrated rather than feared it. I don't need a whole world, she told him, rising on her toes to whisper in his ear. Just a floor to dance on, and you to dance with. His answering smile was as bright as the future opening before them. That, he said, spinning her in a graceful turn that left her breathless, I can most definitely provide. 5 years later, the barn with its beautiful dance floor had become known throughout the county as Ruby's Place, a gathering spot for dances, celebrations, and community events. Reverend Holloway had eventually softened his stance, especially after Ruby and Garrett married, and he performed the ceremony himself, conceding that perhaps God appreciated joyful expression as well as solemn worship. Garrett had built them a home near Mrs. Abernathy's property, with a workshop where he crafted furniture that was now sought after as far away as Austin. Ruby taught dance to the town's children in the afternoons and helped her father in the store mornings, the bond between them stronger than ever. And on warm evenings, when their day's work was done, Garrett would take Ruby's hand and lead her to the floor he had built for her, where they would dance together, their movements telling the story of a love that had transformed not just their lives but an entire town's understanding of what it meant to truly live.